So it's with great pleasure now that I introduce DJ Henry as our speaker for this hour. DJ has extensive experience teaching both college reading and developmental writing courses. And during the course of her teaching career, DJ has been active outside of the classroom as she has been in it, serving on several federally funded grants to infuse teaching and learning with sound pedagogies and technological supports. She worked with the state of Florida as an item writer, a rubric writer, and reader for the college-level academic skills test and the state developmental reading and writing exit exam. And DJ has served as a reader for the Florida Teacher Certification exams. So as an author, DJ strives to help students realize who they are as learners and transfer this understanding to their metamorphosis into independent readers and writers. And to speak to this now, here's DJ.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that wonderful introduction, and it's a great honor to be with you this morning. And I look forward to our question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Let me get my slideshow up and going. I apologize for that. I wanted to focus the comments today in such a way that they would be relevant both to reading and to writing, because the reform that's sweeping the country right now is touching both of those approaches and is actually in many areas bringing them together into one classroom. So the challenges that we're facing as both teachers and students can seem to be unnerving at this particular point, and I just wanted to bring us some information and clarifications that will be very helpful, I think, as we move through this time of change in our discipline. And it was really an opportunity to use reading and writing to learn. So that's the focus of my presentation today, is engaging the student in a student-centered classroom, in the developmental classroom, whether it be reading or writing. Now, when I first began working with developmental students many years ago, there was also a time of great reform at that particular time. In fact, it was through a Title III grant that Daytona State College established their developmental program, and I had the great honor of working as a consultant and a faculty member to get that program started. And I found at that time that I had to completely and totally redefine what I knew to be teaching and learning. I had a very teacher-centered approach before that time, and it was very difficult for me to make that shift. So everything that's come about since then has been based on the premise of a new teaching philosophy. So if you see here on this slide, I'd just like you to take a minute before I throw my ideas up there about what you see to be the goals of teaching and what you see to be the goals of learning, and how those might be different or the same. Let me give you just a second to think about that. Okay, what I came to see is that I had to change my verbs. If you look at the verbs in my teaching goals now, it's to inspire and to empower and to foster and to guide. And I have to be really honest, my verbs before this were to talk, to lecture, to grade, to assess. So it was a huge shift in my paradigm to go into by the elbow instead of center stage, and to make it a student-centered environment instead of a teacher-centered environment. But that meant that there had to be very definite learning goals as well that I not only would expect from my students, but that I could guide them into assuming responsibility for. So those goals are to make connections, to really stir up prior knowledge, and to make that what they already know and what they're bringing into the classroom connect to the new knowledge that we're going to be exploring together as teachers and students. And so many times these students don't think that they have much prior knowledge that's relevant to the classroom, but they do indeed have a wealth of information upon which they can build their literacy. They need to set a purpose. They need to understand that they have a learning need, and they need to learn how to even identify that need. They need to repair confusion, which means they need to feel safe enough to disclose that they are confused and that they don't mistake confusion for failure, and that confusion can be overcome, which means that the student has the responsibility to create knowledge, to construct knowledge, and then once they have that basic understanding, to then build and expand upon that knowledge. So trying to move the student away from what do I have to learn to pass this test, what do I have to learn to pass this course, which has been their fundamental need, their very short-term need, into understanding that developing their literacy is an individual goal that leads to all sorts of self-enrichment. So I guess I would say that the verbs that I had expected from my students before I made this shift is that they would listen as I talked, and then they would perform really based on imitation. Do what I say. Do as I show you. In fact, in many ways it was do it my way. And what I have now come to understand is that we all learn in different manners. And so these students have to take responsibility for their own learning, and they have to construct meaning for themselves. And I am there to inspire, empower, foster, and guide them. With that said, there are some barriers. And one barrier was pointed out in the research by Berryman and Bailey in 1992, and this was research that spanned decades. And I think it's interesting that the way in which they worded their report was that they didn't just say students do not predictably transfer knowledge. They included all of us in this. We as individuals, as human beings, we do not predictably transfer knowledge. It's kind of like we compartmentalize. Well, what do I need to learn for this class? And what do I need to learn for this class? And what does this teacher expect? It's still very teacher-driven and very short-term driven, and there's no real transfer. And it's not only in terms of non-transfer from class to class, but it's also from every day. That prior knowledge that they bring into the classroom, many times they are not transferring that prior knowledge to this new knowledge. And then they're not transferring the new knowledge they gain back to their everyday life. I don't know about you, but I can't tell you how many times a content teacher has stopped me in the hallways and said, why didn't you teach them research? And I'm like, I did teach them research. I just don't think they're transferring the skill into your classroom. And they have to really be guided to do that. They have to see that we value it, and then they value it, and then eventually they own that value for themselves. They see the value in it after we've kind of forced them through it. So this is a real barrier. And that means with this barrier that there are several needs that are overt and that have to be addressed in the learning situation. And the first is student accountability and personal responsibility. And so many of our developmental students just really have not been expected to take responsibility, and they have not been trained to take responsibility. I had the great pleasure of also teaching gifted students for several years in the public school system. And boy, if there's one thing about gifted students, they take responsibility. And they hold themselves, but they also hold the teacher accountable. They're constantly saying, why is this right? Why is this wrong? Not just I want the point, but I want to understand. And that same kind of motivation is what I so desire to give to my students. I want to teach them how to set goals. I want them to identify barriers and then help them find ways to overcome those barriers. So this means it becomes student-based problem solving. Students have to be full partners in the assessment process. It's no longer something I'm doing to them, but it becomes information gathering process that they can use in a formative manner to redirect their studies. So they have to be able to self-assess, but then they also need to know what they can do to fix up their learning strategies, what behaviors would be productive for them. And that means that they need to be directly instructed, and they need to see models of these fix-up learning strategies. And at the end of this presentation, I have about 7 applications, fix-up strategy applications that I'm going to share with you. And I'm really kind of hoping that we can leave a good bit of time for you to look at those and ask questions about them. But the main goal in the student-centered classroom is to transfer responsibility for learning and the monitoring of learning to the student. They become full partners. And again, when I first began this journey a few years back, it didn't seem possible. I mean, how are these students, which seem to be the least engaged, ever going to learn to take responsibility? And I found some real success. It was a struggle. It took me a while to develop my own approach, and that's what I'm sharing with you today is some of the things that have really worked for me in my classroom. And I had to kind of like create it out of whole cloth because I had no model, no teaching model upon which to base it. I had to go out and research and then trial and error. But that's the focus, is to make the student a full partner in their own learning. And of course, they face many barriers, and I know as developmental classroom teachers that you recognize these barriers. They bring in all sorts of behaviors that are counterproductive. Time management, lack of attendance, even really being able to fully appreciate and understand the relationship between the effort that they put into something and the outcome that we measure. So they have many behaviors that need to be addressed, and with those behaviors are habits, lifetime habits that have to be broken. I even think of punctuation as a behavior, a habit that has to be recognized and sometimes overcome. That run-on sentence, that comma splice, that shift in viewpoint, those are really, really bad habits that they may understand the rule, but they don't really take responsibility for changing the habit. They haven't thought about it as a habit that they have to break. And of course they bring in all sorts of attitudes that many times challenge them in their ability to succeed. And the affective domain for the developmental student is a complex area that has really a great deal of research in recent years has been given to that. Their fear of learning, their quirky mixture of I've always done it this way, and I need to learn. You know, they're fearful and prideful at the same time, and it's really hard for them to admit mistakes, or they are overly self-critical and almost self-oppressive. So to find a balance in their attitudes, and many times that's tied to their beliefs. The interesting thing about our students is that sometimes they choose not to learn from us. I read a wonderful little pamphlet one year called by Howard Cole called "I Won't Learn From You," and it was his own autobiographical story about how he was Jewish and he had refused to learn Yiddish because he just didn't want what he considered it to be a stigma. He just wasn't going to learn Yiddish. And then years later, he really regretted that decision, and he talks about the ramifications of what that did to him culturally and emotionally and intellectually. But he said, I made a decision. I won't learn from you. And since I read that book, I look out at my classrooms and I think, is that what's happening here? Is this person bringing in a belief or an attitude that is the foundation of rejection? And sometimes that even comes from value systems. I think of the student who believed in creationism, and she just really had a barrier to learning evolution because it just was sinful for her to accept that concept. So really being able to understand what their barriers are is important for us as teachers, but it's more important that the student understand that and make some kind of decision about what they as he or she as an individual is going to do with that behavior, that habit, that attitude, or that belief. Because we cannot force them to learn. They have to be willing and engaged, or it's all for short term. It's all for the grade. So with these barriers identified, we still need to understand that we want to guide them into transferring what they're learning in spite of these barriers. So there is hope. research has indicated that training programs that have proven successful, that really do make a difference in outcomes, in student behaviors and attitudes and outcomes, have these characteristics in common. They force the student to be actively involved. These programs, these teachers provide feedback in the value, the necessity of the action of the concept being taught. And this is really, really becoming far, far more important than it was in the past, just based on generational differences. Our parents and the traditionalists really didn't have to be told why something was important. They respected authority and they submitted to authority, and they learned because they were told to. The millennials, the younger generation that's out there now that has had so many options of different ways to get information and to make meaning, and who have been raised to believe that they're very special people and entitled people, they want to know how is this important, and they also want to know how is this important in terms of getting a job. The younger generation really is very practical and utilitarian. They're almost like, not almost like, they're consumers of information, which is a big shift from the way in which I, as a baby boomer, my relationship with information and with teachers. So they have to be provided instruction in why and when and where learning activities should be applied. So these three traits really do drive student-centered learning and have proven through research that they are successful. And so that's what I've tried to do, is create some activities for students that have all three of these involved. But there's still another challenge. Always the challenges, right? Studying requires a double or split mental focus. It's really multitasking. On the one hand, our students have to learn the material, the content, the vocabulary, the grammar rule. For us, we teach in reading and writing. Our content is a process, or two processes really, the reading process and the writing process. So our students have to absorb that, but at the same time, they have to constantly check and monitor their understanding. So they're learning, and then the most successful students are also thinking about their learning, the metacognitive aspect of all of this. And more and more metacognitive strategies are becoming super important, particularly as we move into this time of reform where in some parts of the country I've seen that the reform is going into individualized instruction based on diagnostic testing and individual learning plans, which means that there's not an opportunity for the direct instruction through lecture, that it's really individualized, so students do have to take on more and more responsibility. So they need to be metacognitively aware. And then in other parts of the country, the reform is bringing the reading and the writing into one classroom. So, and reducing the amount of time that students are in the developmental classroom. Many classes across the country are now running entire semesters in 6 to 8 weeks. And then when those students finish the developmental course, they enter into a 6 or 8 week freshman composition course. It's a tremendous amount of pressure to put on these students who are historically our most challenged students. So they really need to be taught metacognitive strategies. So comprehension-fostering and comprehension-monitoring activities are so key, and they need to be strategic, and they need to be explicit, and they have to be done in the context of the content of the course. We can't assume that these students can just know how to do this. It has to be directly taught. And so here are the key behaviors, if you will, metacognitive behaviors that really do reach across both reading and writing. Both readers do this and writers do this. And of course it's summarizing and questioning and clarifying and predicting. And all of these have to be directly instructed and modeled through guided learning. So I really did have to give up the lecture. All of my dissemination of information to my students now are in mini lectures, or they're in group work called reciprocal teaching, and I have a. We're going to look at that at the. It's one of the documents that I have to share with you, so that students learn collaboratively the key concepts at the beginning of the unit, at the beginning of the week, and then the rest of the week and the unit is spent in individual or small group work with me, moving from student to student, from elbow to elbow, in a mentor capacity instead of the lecturer in front of the classroom. So here are some of the fix-up learning strategies that you're going to be seeing some examples of. First of all is the think aloud, which is the reader or the learner's, really it should be learner's verbalization of his or her thoughts as she or he reads or learns. And this is something that's really great for teachers to model. At the very beginning of the semester, I make it I take a couple of different lessons and I talk about what my thinking is as I go through that particular activity. For example, if I'm teaching something on, like for example, a semicolon or a fused sentence or something like that, as I am going through that lesson with them, I actually pull up a piece of writing and I talk about the decision that I had to make at that point. So I'm verbalizing my mental thought processes about the application of a very specific concept. Self-assessment inventories, and I know that you are probably rich with these in your curriculum already, rubrics of student outcomes and surveys and questionnaires, and this is where I really try to individualize my discussions with my students and really turn them into conferences when I see counterproductive behaviors or attitudes or beliefs. Of course, there are some of these that are universal enough that I can create some almost generic surveys and attitude checklist and have students fill them out and then ask them to bring evidence of these things in action, and then that becomes the basis of a conversation, a conference with me. Or sometimes I have to create a new one on the spot based on the context of what I've seen in the classroom. But by creating these kinds of inventories, it makes it an objective discussion instead of it being something personal, like you don't like me or you just you're out to get me. Sometimes that kind of an attitude, that defensiveness, is completely eradicated with the formality of it being a document that they have to check, fill in, and then give evidence of. And then again, reciprocal teaching, which we're going to look at in a few minutes. And many of you probably are already aware of reciprocal teaching. I just want to tie it into this philosophy here. So the student-centered classroom, this is the teaching and learning mission, is to create an environment that contextualizes learning, that is constantly activating prior knowledge and asking them to tie that prior knowledge to the lesson and in progress. Foster metacognition, transfer that responsibility for monitoring achievement and problem solving to the student, and then to utilize authentic learning and assessment as much as possible, to really have them offer proof. In fact, one of the things I tell my students is that they have to prove. You have to prove you have learned something. When they come to me and they say, what do I have to do to pass this test, or what do I have to do to get an A in this class, I always counter with, you have to prove you've learned. And that then gives meaning to whatever test or activity that I'm giving them. This is an opportunity to prove, to build a portfolio, if you will, of proof. So these are the principles that I have put in place in terms of these 7 handouts now, or these 7 applications. And I just want to go through these kind of quickly. I'm going to go through them quickly, and then during the question and answer time, you can bring me back to any one of them, and we can look at it in a little bit more detail. First of all, individualized educational plans are just becoming more and more crucial, particularly with the modularization of developmental education and with the combination of reading and writing and the short amount of time that students now have to succeed and then go on to the college level class. So what this is an individualized learning plan that breaks the learning down into 3 phases throughout a semester. And the diagnostic phase is the student self-assessment of needs and goals. And as you can see, this is a list of anything and everything that the students are expected to do. Any academic or intellectual task that they have to create a written record of it, and then they have to do a self-analysis. And these what do I already know, what do I need to learn, these questions at the bottom of the page are actually given to them every single time they do a new activity, so that these answers to these questions are actually recorded in an ongoing fashion in their journals and their portfolios. So when they come to the time where they're going to write this report for me, they've already done the pre-writing for it. And you can see that this is using both reading and writing to learn. The second phase is the working phase. This is the entire semester work, and this is encouraging them to monitor their progress, both their commitment and their progress. And again, this is just a list of possible contents. The contents of this working portfolio would, of course, be very content specific based on the context of your particular classroom. And again, notice the questions. What do I need to learn? What is my barrier? But then we're going beyond that. What steps can I take or will I take to overcome this barrier? And that means, what pages do I need to study in my textbook? How will a writing lab help me? How will the Pearson My Writing Lab or My Reading Lab, what will I do specifically in that lab to help me? And how can I prove? What evidence will I generate and put in my portfolio to prove that I've learned this concept? And then the last phase, which is the very end of the semester, is the achievement phase. And this is where they choose best works to prove mastery. And again, there's a list of things that they can pull from, and then there is a list of questions that they can use to guide them as they write up this achievement report. And of course, they're going back and they're looking at what their baseline at the beginning of the semester and the effort that they put forth in their working portfolio. And they are asking for a grade. They are saying, I deserve an A because, and then they're giving the reasons and they're pointing me to proof. So this is even teaching them the basis of argument before they even know that they have to learn argument. Okay, the next one is the KWL worksheet, and this is a reading strategy, a metacognitive reading strategy that I use in both the reading classes and in the writing classes. Anytime I introduce a new concept, at the beginning of every chapter, I ask them to fill out this chart. Sometimes they can fill this out as a group if they would like to, but it's far better to do this individually. This goes with the individual educational plan. And you can see that if they keep a track record of this, I mean, here's their proof. This is how they're building proofs throughout the semester that they've learned. So what I already know about this concept, I mean, again, let's go back to the semicolon. When was the first time, I asked my students, when was the first time you heard the term semicolon? And they'll tell you, elementary school. So what do you know about the semicolon? You know, so, and then what do I want to know, or what do I wonder about, or what will I learn? And this is a little bit harder for them. This is a prediction that they have to make, and this is an acquired skill. They get better at this as they go on. And then the how I might find out about is a problem solving. Where's the answer to this? If I need to know something, where could I go? In my textbook? Maybe I need a teacher conference. Maybe I need to go to a tutor. So where's the solution? And then after learning, what I have learned. So this is a before, during, and after learning activity. And I ask them to track it throughout the semester on every new concept and skill that we come across. Okay, now this is the reciprocal teaching steps, and when you look at this, don't go, oh my goodness. It does look pretty dense, I know, but if you notice the bold summarizing, questioning, clarifying, and predicting, these are the four intellectual behaviors that students must do. Now again, remember I said that this is how I actually teach now. This is, instead of doing lectures, unless I do very many lectures, 5 to 10 minutes, no longer than 15, God willing, if I'm able to keep it short. But what I do is I put students into groups of 4, and then I hand them a note card, index card that has one of these roles written on each one of the index cards. And then we look at the first page of the chapter, and I quite easily to do this based on the bold headings that are in a chapter. Our textbooks are so wonderful that they offer bold headings for every major topic. So we'll maybe do one full section, and one person will summarize. And summarization is a really good thing to do, not only as an after reading or after studying activity, but ahead of time as well, where you skim and you say, okay, well, I think that this is the main point that we're going to get across. But they read silently for a few minutes, and then one of them will summarize. Another person will ask questions about the material. A third person will try to clarify or come up with answers to those questions, or they will record questions for the teacher, and then they'll predict, what's coming up, what is going to be the most important thing that I need to learn here, or this is going to be important because. So that's all this sheet is doing. It's just kind of laying out the steps for reciprocal teaching. And then the next handout is an actual worksheet that I ask them to use. And again, they can use this as a group, and then they can have a group recorded worksheet. But I find most of my students, they will do that, and they'll turn that group one into me. But many of them, most of them really, like to have their own worksheets for their own portfolios, for their own notebooks. So they fill this out, and again, this is something that they do to record that they are actively involved in the learning process. And this has been a really powerful tool in terms of pinpointing exactly what it is that the students are confused about, and that I can go in and intervene and repair that confusion or direct them to an activity that will do that. Now, the SQ3, our students are so visual that I find that it was the best way to really teach them the reading process and how they themselves can individualize the reading process, because we all really do individualize it. We move through these steps differently. And you can see that with the arrows and the way the graphic is that this isn't like step 1, we're going to survey, and then we're never going to survey again until we're through reading. But rather, these are steps that students can move back and forth between or among. And you see that it identifies to the student that there are 3 phases to reading: before, during, and after. And then again, I've turned this into a checklist for students. The very first week of class, before there's been any instruction whatsoever, I hand this out to them and I say, just check off all the things that you do. And it's okay if you don't do these things. Just, be honest and just check off what you do. And of course, there are always those that check off everything. Oh, I do all of this. And so then I ask for proof. Okay, give me some proof that you've done these things. So quite quickly they learn to be accountable in terms of being realistic. I don't mean to say honest, but that's the best word that comes out, that they can't deceive themselves, because it's a hard copy checklist, and then they have to provide hard copy evidence and proof. And you can see where KWL would give them proof that they've done these things, as with the reciprocal teaching worksheet. So this is used throughout the semester to track the changes that they make to their reading process as they learn more how to control their reading process. And students love this. They love to see the changes, and they love to document the changes as they occur. And of course, I have one for writing as well. And this one is a little bit different than the reading one, because with the reading one I didn't put in a self-assessment on time on task, because we move back and forth in our reading process in a little bit different way in which we move back and forth in our writing process. And I found that students really and truly my students anyway, did one draft, and they did it on their computer. And maybe they did more drafts as they went in there and they changed words and stuff like that, but they didn't do more than one printed draft. They would turn in that one draft, and many of them did it right before class or late the night before. So what this does, particularly with the time on task assessment is, well, are you really using the full writing process? And then when they get scores or feedback that indicates that their writing is not as strong as they want it to be, then here we have a place that they can identify, they can solve a problem. Oh, well, maybe if I spent more time on this, then that would improve my final product. Students also loved this. And then the final one I wanted to share with you was a test repair. And I tell my students everything's a test. There's no busy work in my class. Everything's a test. When they come to me and they say, did I miss anything in class today? I went, yes. You always miss something important in class. There's no busy work. So it doesn't matter what I'm asking them to do. It's a test of their comprehension. It's a test of their learning. So I want them to know how to really monitor their own progress and to use every activity, particularly those high-stakes tests, whether it's a grammar test, whether it's a reading comprehension test, whether it's an essay exam. I want them to know before the test, what did I do to prepare and study? And what do I think I'm going to get on this? What score do I think this is going to earn me? And then right after the test, immediately after the test, if it's an objective test particularly, what was I confused about? Or an essay exam, an in-class test, what really worries me the most? And I even ask them to go and start looking in their textbooks, go find a page number that might address your concern. And then once they get the feedback from me, once they get a score from me, I ask them to go and reassess what they predicted they were going to do on the test. And the very interesting thing is that I have as many students who underestimate their achievement as I do students who overestimate. So sometimes they think they failed and they've done really, really well. So that anxiety can still be a learning barrier for them. So it's really a way for them to learn how to assess themselves realistically. And again, this is something that requires some practice, and it doesn't come naturally or easily the first time. But with practice, they get quite good at this. So those are the applications of the student-centered classroom. And before I open it up to questions, I just wanted to share this last quote that I think it's kind of interesting John Dewey gave to us so long ago. If we continue to teach our students today as we taught them yesterday, we rob them of tomorrow. And that's exactly what drove me from moving from a teacher-centered classroom into a student-centered classroom. I just didn't want to lose any more of my students. I wanted to make them the center. And I feel really good that and have a lot of evidence that these applications work. So I'm eager to hear your questions or your comments.
Hi, DJ. Thank you very much. That was superb. I'm going to combine about the first 8 or 10 questions into one, which is, how do you have time to do all this in the classroom? It seems to be a pretty popular question among everyone.
Well, I have to admit that was a real challenge for me as well when I first began this, and the way in which it has been very helpful to put the responsibility for learning the information directly on the student. So when I moved to collaborative learning, for example, the first chapter I start with in my reading classes is, the reading process, that chapter. So that first day that we're looking at that, I use reciprocal teaching, and I put them in small groups, and they are teaching each other material, and then I'm going around and I'm listening, and I pretty quickly see where the questions are, and then can address those questions pretty rapidly. After that, the rest of the week is given over to individualized work, so that I have time to be with them at their elbow. I have an opportunity to talk to every single student at least once throughout that week. So it's a matter of having these things pre-made and then giving them a great deal of independent work, and then going around and sitting at their elbows throughout the class period.
And with that independent work part, DJ, to answer, I guess, a couple more questions that are coming in about how much time, is there kind of like a finite number that you expect them to work on this outside of the classroom, or is it just what they have to do outside of the classroom? That a couple people were asking that as well.
Well, what I have found that when I do the reciprocal teaching in the classroom and they really do become engaged, and then when their learning plans have been individualized, then they really are more likely to do they then do carry on the work outside of class. So I kind of tend to get them started in class, and we make a great deal of headway in class, and then they do continue it. And the other way in which our classrooms at Daytona State have historically been arranged, of course this is all in flux now, with the reforms, but we had 4 hours with them in class, and then they had a 5th hour in the lab every week. So we met with them every day, 5 days a week, and so that's a lot of time. That's a lot of face-to-face time, and then they had that full day of independent work that they were expected to work in the lab. So the way that our program was set up at Daytona State, it worked quite well.
Okay. Question came in from Maria, and it's, do you have specific examples of the activities you used? For example, you mentioned run-ons, or maybe since I teach reading skills, main idea, I guess, or she's interested in specific.
You mean in terms of having you mean in addition to the things that I've put up there, like using the KWL with the main idea?
I guess she's wanting, maybe she'll write to confirm, if you have specific means of incorporating that, or if it's like a step-by-step, or if it's, does that make sense?
Well, I take the things that I've shown you today, like for example the KWL, and I would, in fact, do you mind if I kind of go back to that slide? Oh my goodness, let me go to that particular slide where I can get to the documents. Let me go to the KWL worksheet. Where it says concept right here, I would put in main idea. And then right here with what I know, and this is like a talk aloud, I talk aloud with my students the first couple of times I do this with them. So I put main idea here, and then I would ask them to call up what they already know about the main idea, and we'd fill this out together. And then I would ask them on an individual basis to record a few questions about what they want to know. And that's really kind of asking them to think about what they're confused about, and come up with a couple of those questions. And then I will ask them to share those questions, so that they can see that they all really do have the same questions. And then how I might find out about, I actually then have them go through the chapter and identify, based on what they've said with the two columns up above, what page numbers of the textbook are going to be more relevant to them, the most relevant to them. And even the reading lab, my reading lab, what lessons will they go and look at that. And then afterwards, of course, after they've learned, after they've studied, they come back and they fill in what I have learned. So I take this and I individualize this based on I make this applicable to any skill or concept I'm teaching. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I'll just have her let me know about that, and while she's doing that. Next question came in from Robert. How can we address severely at-risk students? I guess maybe he's asking if there's extra measures to take.
Well, I actually find that these severely at-risk students respond the absolute best to this, because when I see a student that is highly challenged, I think of, like in my reading class, sometimes we get students in there who are 6th grade and below. And we're expecting them. All the research indicates that in one semester they need to make it. They need to make it out of that class, that developmental class, into a college class in one semester. And so I find that if I am very honest with those students and say, listen, they know that they're greatly challenged. We're going to individualize this instruction to meet your specific needs, and you're going to be a full partner in this. They super respond to that. For one, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, but I think of our developmental students as the invisible students. People have not had conversations like this with them. People have assumed that they don't care. and that they can't do. So just having this conversation with them is a great relief to many of them. So I actually believe the individualization and some of these things that I'm showing you here are really, really helpful for the most at-risk students. It's really for them that, that these were developed. Because the stronger students grab this and go. But those weaker students, the guided direction and the ongoing conversation.
Okay. Just sorry, scrolling through the questions right now. I saw one and I lost it. Actually, I do have. Here it is. Okay. Do you tailor these to the different? And I guess this piggybacks off the question we just asked from Robert. Is you know, are you able to tailor these to the specific specific level of the developmental student?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. In fact, I think the students themselves do that when they start saying the different levels has a lot to do with the scope and sequence of the curriculum. Like I think about we had 3 levels of reading. That's changing, but we had 3 levels, and at the lowest level, there was nothing about fact and opinion, tone and purpose, and nothing about argument and persuasion. So just based on the scope and sequence, that in itself is a limitation. But you can see just by looking at the KWL that this in itself is self-adapting. The lower student is going to have a different response to this than the higher student. And then the wonderful thing about that is, because we do peer reviews with their portfolios, is that those stronger students become models for the lower level students, and they then begin to imitate what those higher level students are doing and pull them up. It's like the higher pull up the lower. So, and that comes about because they have these visible worksheets, if you will, these graphic organizers that make their intellectual behavior visible.
Okay, very cool. Well, that's all we have time for. So, DJ, thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your practices and research and knowledge with us and the folks in the audience. And just a reminder to the folks in the audience, we are recording this session, so we'll be posted to the Speaking About Developmental English site in approximately a month, depending on how quickly the company can turn around the files. And we could also, and it'll have available the PowerPoints, and we can make available the documents and such. So with that told, DJ, thank you once again, and thank you to everyone in the audience.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
You as well.